I think we are running out of time, and I would like to thank all of you for your time on the panel, and I would like all of you to give them a round of applause for this insightful session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much to our moderator, to our panelists. Thank you so much, Gaurav Karnik sir. Thank you so much, Sanjay sir, Vipul sir, Pankaj sir, Santosh sir, Hardeep sir. Once again, a round of applause as we come to the conclusion of our very interesting session on investment opportunities and other aspects in land pooling. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Our last session for today, that is on land pooling innovative implementation methods. As you all know that land pooling is aimed at partnering landowners and preventing acquisition sans the owner's consent. The land pooling policy Delhi involves the formation of consortium by the applicants of a sector qualifying under the policy. The consortium will mutually arrive at an arrangement implementation plan amongst the landholders for redistribution. In this session, we'll be looking at how various collaboration models can be adopted for the implementation of the policy. Moving ahead, we'll be looking at the international case study and the Indian case study also. At the start, we are delighted to have amongst us a very distinguished guest, and we are indeed honored that he has spared some of his precious time from his busy schedule and agreed to enlighten us on the implementation aspect. Once again, everyone, with a round of applause, let's welcome Mr. Pedro Ortiz, Senior Consultant on Metropolitan Management and Planning, International Governmental Organization, United Nations, European Union, UN Habitat, World Bank, Indo-American Development Bank, amongst others. So, welcome, a very good afternoon. A round of applause, everyone. And to enlighten us on the Indian case study aspect, we have amongst us Mr. Ishan, Director, Magarpata City Group. Mr. Ishan, welcome, sir. And Mr. Shri A.M. Jagani ji, Deputy Town Planner, Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority. Jagani sir, welcome. And with this, let's get into learning more into the aspect of land pooling since 1956. And I'll request Pedro, sir, to begin the deliberations from here. Sir, over to you. Sir, yes, sir. You want to, okay.
Well, apart from now being an international consultant for the multilaterals, my experience with land pooling has been that I've been mayor of the center of Madrid, central Madrid, and then later on in charge of the metropolis of Madrid. So I had to approve the master plans of 180 municipalities, and all these municipalities worked with a land pooling system. And I had to control that. And I had to write the land law of Madrid region, which as well sets up the land pooling system. This is the, I presume, no? So in Spain and Madrid, land pooling has been working since 1956. So we already have 60 years of experience. And it works very well, and it is essential. Without land pooling, we will not be able to address the huge growth that Madrid, as many emerging metropolises, are experiencing. Let me say why the experience of Madrid might be relevant for India. Spain did not develop in the early 19th century like the rest of Europe with the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. Spain took a century long, and Spain developed mainly on the 1960s, 1950s, 60s, in the second half of the 20th century. And then the growth were staggering. We were growing at 6%, 8% per year, the explosion of growth. And the need for housing for all that people that were moving from rural to urban was immense. And we had to produce that enormous amount of housing. I think India is in a similar situation, and you are experiencing, the minister was saying some figures that I do have as well, and I work with them in another setting. Around the world, 300,000 people every day are moving to cities, and in India, it's 50,000 people which are moving to cities every day, which is absolutely immense, the amount of housing that you have to produce to be able to respond for that. You see, when you grow by 5%, and many metropolises in India are growing by 5% annual, that means that every 14 years you have to double the size of that city. That means that some cities have taken 2,000 or 6,000 years to arrive to this moment, and 6,000 years have to be doubled in 14 years, which is a challenge that you can only develop with systems like land pooling, because the public sector cannot handle all that. No? And generally, politicians, when they know they cannot handle a challenge, they try to lie on the figures and say, well, run those figures down, but those are the real figures that we are finding. So you see, this is the difference between a land pooling system and a non-land pooling system. On the top, an area which has been developed as a land pooling, and in the bottom, an area that has been anarchical development, and both photographs are from Madrid, Spain. I would like to point out in the upper photo that you see where the metro, the underground station is not the issue of the last mile, is the issue of the last 50 meters. I mean that all those developments, all these TODs, all those housing developments have to be within 300 meters of a metro station to the city to work. In India, you have a car ownership of 1.5 cars per 10 people. You are going to run into 7 cars per 10 people. Plus the affluence of people to the metropolis, you are going to multiply the number of cars in your metropolis by 10 or by 15. So if you already have jams, imagine if you multiply by 15 the number of cars. So the only way to work out that is putting the houses close to the metro stations, close to the rail stations, in such a way that the system will work with commuting. So these are the two examples of land pooling to the left and non-land pooling to the right. And obviously, the inheritance we will leave for our children or grandchildren is completely different. And you see in the left, that large avenue is the one that has the metro underground. We don't like metros overground because then they break the continuity of the city, and or they are on stilts and they break the quality of the environment. So we want all the metros underground. It is double expensive. It costs double what a metro on stilts, but it is the effect, the impact, the benefits, the efficiency is multiplied by 3, by 4, by 5, because you don't have anymore the problem of the last mile. So our land law sets up 3 ways of managing the land. We are not talking about urban design. We are not talking about where you put the blocks or where you put the parks or where you put the facilities. That's urban design. It is how we manage land, no? And we have 3 ways of managing land, and we call them compensación, which is sharing, balance, that's land pooling, and it is the private initiative, and it's 90% of our cities and our buildings, obviously. Our cities are made that way. No? Then we have, in the other side, expropriation, which is compulsory purchase, so the intervention of the government, getting that land and developing it, and that's more or less 5%. It's very special cases where there is a lot of social externalities that have to be provided for that site, and the private sector cannot make for those social externalities, and so it's, the private sector is not interested in getting to that kind of project, and then it has to be by compulsory purchase and expropriation. And then cooperation is when land pooling doesn't work. I mean, when the conditions cannot be met or the management of the land pooling has not succeeded, they ask us to I am talking as a public sector because that was my role. They ask us to intervene to do the infrastructure and to provide the infrastructure that they will pay. They will pay against the value of the increase of that increase of the value of that land, but we will do the infrastructure. And obviously, if we do it, we, public sector, it will be more expensive than if the private sector does it. So rarely that happens, because they know that if they are in a situation they are not able to manage the land pooling and they ask for that help, really is going to be much more expensive. As you see, in the first is the private initiative, in the last one is public initiative, and in the middle one, the cooperation, is public urbanizes, private pays but keeps the land and is owner of the land, sells it and then pays back. No? The problem with land pooling is that the private sector is obviously much more capable than the public sector to produce. No? The efficiency of the production of the city in terms of time and money is much more efficient in the private sector than the public sector. The problem with the private sector is first that the private sector does not have to account in social externalities. On the benefits to society, that's not the private sector. The private sector has to develop products, sell them, and make money. And the problems of how those externalities benefit or impact society is to be taken by the public sector. So social externalities, the private sector is bad at that. The internalization of long-term externalities. No? When you deal with the city, you're producing something which is going to be there in 200 years, in 300 years, in 400 years. And the private sector, the only thing it cares is really by producing something that it will sell as quick as possible, pay the loans and get the benefits. So these long-term externalities have to be as well thought of and provided by the public sector. And then the private sector is looking obviously for marginal return. If there is somewhere else that they can put the money that will have more benefits than in an alternative, they will put the money where the marginal returns will be higher. And some of the projects that have to be developed in a city for making the city worthwhile in 500 years, because we have to think in 500 years, some of those projects do not produce enough marginal return. You don't lose money, but do not produce enough marginal returns, so the private sector rather gets into another project rather than in these important projects. And then there is a size limitation, and it was mentioned by someone in the panel. No? There is a moment that if the project is too large, it's very difficult to gather the capital by the private sector, because really the capital accumulation becomes too large. No? And then it has to be the public sector. So it is important the size of the pooling units to be able to match the capacity of the private sector to raise the money and to organize it. The problem, and I don't want to get into ideology, is always who gets the benefits of the plus values of the development. No? Is it the public sector that has invested on the main infrastructures that have made that land accessible and then has increased the value of that land? Or it is the private sector which develops that land once the infrastructures are there, and it is the private initiative, so they are owned. So that is a conflict that is always in all developing discussions in our countries in Europe, is always who is really the owner of the plus values of development. But that's an ideological issue. What we do have to develop the land pooling is obviously we have, not always, but sometimes, and in the case of Madrid we did, a metropolitan scale plan that defined what was the main infrastructure of the metropolis, and that is obviously made by the public. The private cannot do that. No. Then the urban scale plan, in the Anglo-Saxon world is called the master plan. We call them the general plan, which sets up the regulation of the land, of each plot of land in a municipality. And then it defines areas of common development, and those are the land pooling areas. So then the urban design, which we call the sector, the polygon, and those are the polygons that go into land pooling. So it's not the master plan and it's not the regional plan, obviously. If the private sector was able to do a regional plan, then we will not need a government, because then the private sector will be able to run the country as well. That kind of size cannot be done by the private sector. So then we have the urban design, which is the sector, the polygon. and it's the private property, the owners of the land that develop that, and then the construction, the plot, individual plot, which is the private. No? So we have all these scales that have to be dealt with. But when we go into the scale of the urban design, the sector, the polygon, we call that as well polygon, the system of land pooling that we have, I've heard that you require 70% of the owners to get into the land pooling consortium. We call them juntas de compensación, sharing assemblies. We only require 61% of the owners. No? And in some countries, in Latin America, they only require 50%. I think 50% is too little, because the owners which do not agree are going to be forced into the operation, and I think that 50 or 51% is not enough to force 49 guys not to accept, to have to accept the process. No? So 61 is what we use, and it works. We don't have the problems I've heard about the farmers. No? The farmers are very happy to bring their land to the land pooling, because they know that they are going to earn a lot of money, that they will pay the studies of their children and their grandchildren, and maybe their grandchildren, because there is a lot of benefits into the process. So they are very happy to sell the land, to include the land in the land pooling. So it's different cultures that have to adapt. But we don't have, even though the problem is that 10, 15 years before the land pooling starts, people stop farming, because they know that the city is coming and they don't want to plant potatoes anymore. They get a mortgage, they get whatever, and they start living on the benefits of that future land. So there is expectations rather than against. No? So we need 61% of ownerships, and then in that assembly you are represented by the percentage of land that you have brought to the land pooling. Let me say, even if it's in the next slide, I think, that we don't think that more than 40 hectares is practical in land pooling, because to manage more than 40 hectares, the private sector has difficulties. So we worked within 1 hectare to 40 hectares. I was surprised and concerned 3 years ago. I have been working in Mumbai, that they have an area in the south of Mumbai that they call Nanai or something like that, that is going to be land pooling. No? And it's a huge area without plan from the government. That doesn't work. The private sector is not able to manage that. You have to make the plan, you have to define the polygons, you even have, as we will see in the next slide, we'll even have to define the streets and the squares or the location of the main social facilities, thinking about those long-term externalities which belong to the public sector's responsibility. And then you provide that for the private sector to develop. So these landowners that have formed a society, which is called the junta, the sharing assembly, they have to draft the partial plan, the area, under the direction of the municipality, and there are sometimes problems because the municipality in the master plan has broadly defined what they want, but to go into the design, the specific design, there might be confrontation of interest. The private sector wants to put the buildings close to an accessibility point, and the public sector thinks that they have to be set up in another location. So there are conflicts. It's not automatic, no, and sometimes it takes a long time to have that approval. So the assembly has to make the partial plan. Then the assembly as well makes the urbanization process. They have to build the roads, build the sewage, build the water, build the power, and so on. And the money they use to do that are loans from the banks. And everyone will have to pay the percentage that corresponds to his percentage of ownership on the polygon. And it was mentioned as well before, the difficulties of those loans from the banks. Obviously, the difficulty is on the risk. Is not in the returns of the money, because the returns are massive. Is on the risk and the time of the length of that loan. No, but if the local authority is able to set up a system which is transparent and it's easy to manage and so on, the risk is immediately lowered, because everyone knows the time and so on that all this will take, and then there is no problem of that lending. And that lending is the owners which belong to the assembly. It's not a developer, it's the owners. If the developer wants to belong to the assembly, he has to buy the land before he joins the assembly. So the land is there, the land has already value, and so the banks lend that money without problem. Then they build the infrastructure, streets, water, sewage, power, landscaping, and sometimes facilities. And that is part of the negotiation between the local authority and the assembly, the junta. Sometimes the local authority requires to build the school, requires to build the different elements that might be on charge of the local authorities, but in this case they say, well, either you do it or we don't approve the development. And that is part of the negotiation, the political negotiation. Then the SFR is distributed among the plots, no? And if you had 2% of the land, you will have 2% of the SFR, and that SFR will be in a plot as close as possible to your previous ownership of the land. And you might have one plot, or you might have just a proportion of the plot. I have to finish. 5 minutes, that's a lot. Thank you. You will get maybe 2/3 of a plot, and if those 2/3 is three-story buildings, you will have 2 stories, but you will have to agree with the other owner on developing that or selling it to a developer. No? And then the plots, once the infrastructure, we do not allow to build before the infrastructure is done. So you must have the roads made, the sewage, the water, the power, and so on, before you are allowed to build. I am lying. You are allowed to start to build, but you are not allowed to finish building before the infrastructure. No, because then we will have a lot of buildings without the infrastructure. We do not allow the finishing. You can overlap, but never the finishing of the buildings before the infrastructure is done, and obviously not the selling. Then the plots are developed and sold individually with the planning regulations according to the master plan, and there is no problem with that. So you see, this is a kind of feature that is in the master plan for the land pooling to be. The red arrow is mine, no? To show that sometimes the municipality says where the street should be or where the social facilities should be, because there are aspects that affect the social externalities, and that is it. And sometimes even the design is more advanced by the local authority, like in the left, in the right case. No? So you see, this is the kind of feature, file, which is in the master plan, and then rules the land pooling process of that group. The owners of that polygono, of that form, get together. If there are 61% that want to develop it, then they can form the junta. And if there is not 61 and they are not able to develop, or they have a tricky approach of letting time pass by, because the more time passes, the higher the value, and they are going to speculate, then the public authority can intervene, can compulsory purchase, and can do it on its own without the private sector. So they know that if they do not comply with the regulations of the master plan, they will not get the benefits of the development. So really, there are rules in the system. Limits and difficulties. By law, this is planning. This is not land pooling. So this is the previous requirements to the land pooling process. By law, 50% of any development has to be land either for public space, gray or green, or social facilities. So only housing can be in 50% of the land. Out of those housing in 50% of the land, 50% of those housing has to be social protected. That doesn't mean that the developer doesn't earn money, does not have benefits. They have benefits, but the rules of the quality of the materials, the amount of space, all the elements make that the developer doesn't get rich with that kind of development. In the free market, in the other 50%, they can do whatever they want, and that's where they really get the benefits that they compensate. So we mix, and that has a social purpose. We mix all earning wealth classes in the same area, And that has the intention of not creating ghettos of poor or ghettos of rich. That way the society is more interwoven and is more resilient to changes and to the future. And then, even though 10% of the final land for housing has to be given away to the public authority, because with that land, the public authority makes a land bank, and then they can either sell it to pay for infrastructure, or either sell it, or either use it to buy another land, to exchange with another land which is necessary for other means, like a hospital, like a university, or like an infrastructure. So obviously the developers always complain with these figures, but these figures have worked, and Spain has developed in a developed country and is part now of Europe in the same level as the other. If the developers retain the land, make retention for speculative purposes, because the more the city developers are on you and your land is not developed, the more value it has. Then if they try to get a monopoly, then we come on and we break down that by creating competition with smaller pooling units that they will fight one to each other competing, or we can introduce a compulsory purchase, or we can change the regime from land pooling to expropriation in the process if the private sector is not able to respond to the needs and requirements of the and sometimes that speculative retention is time, maximizing land value expectatives and pushing, or the conflicts as well are pushing the interpretation of the SFR amount, typology, location to the limit. As I mentioned before, the owners of the land rather have all the buildings close to the main entrance, the main avenue, or the main highway, because that land is more valuable, and there are other purposes of sharing. And the amount of SFR that we use is generally 0.4 meters per square meter. I don't know if for India that is much or that is little. And then the minister was mentioning figures that when I calculated back in my head were around 0.8 meters per square meters. We work with half that SFR, 0.4, but we distribute that SFR in such a way that the main bulk of the construction is around the metro stations, and so in those areas we really have the same kind of figures the minister was saying, 0.8 meters per square meter, and but it's distributed with parks and universities, hospitals, schools, and so on. So the solution is so if the developers, the private sector, doesn't not work in a fair way in this kind of dialogue, then we intervene and we compulsory purchase. And this is an alternative we invented, but as we don't have any time, later on, if you catch me on the corridors, I can explain it to you. And this is another type of intervention, which is not in the law, but can be implemented in the practice. Thank you very much. I hope I have been useful by the information I've given you. Thank you.
Respected sir, thank you so much for that very invaluable information. Once again, a round of applause to thank Mr. Ortiz. Thank you so much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, in our next presentation, we will get to know about the Magarpata city in the village of Hatsapur in Pune, built over 600 acres of land. This was done by visionary Sri Satish Magarji. Now, this is one of the success stories when we talk about land pooling in India. To take us through this journey, may I request Sri Ishan Magarji, sir, please join us for the remarks. Once again, a round of applause to welcome Ishan Magarji.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting to you a very innovative and a very comprehensive land pooling concept which has given birth to a township called Magarpata city. So Magarpada city is a 400-acre township which is situated in Pune. So Pune is a city, a few hours away from Mumbai. This is the first of its kind. Yeah. So this is the first scheme of its kind. It is the first private land pooling scheme. And it is an excellent example of also a carbon positive inclusive development, which I will get to a little ahead in my presentation. Before I talk to you about the concept of land pooling, I would like to explain a little bit of a history or brief behind the area, because of which the entire land pooling concept came up. So in 1990s, what happened was that Pune was experiencing a lot of rapid growth and urbanization.